For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. You may be seated. The book of Ruth is a wonderful book and a great story. And it's worth a read from one end to the other, if for no other reason, just for entertainment. The book of Ruth is a great romance, and it's got everything in it, from tragedy to love, and the bridging of social classes through love. It's like a Jane Austen novel, shortened in some ways. But nonetheless, even though the story is so well known, and even though we've heard this verse, I'm sure, again and again at wedding after wedding after wedding, nonetheless, there's an important narrative. There's an important story arc for a specific character that I think is often overlooked. And it's precisely that character that I want to focus on today. That is the character of Naomi. Naomi is a woman who experiences great tragedy. And she's not at the center of the story, but without her, the story couldn't happen. Without her, there's this empty element. And she has a story of her own that I think is beautiful and meaningful and worth looking at. Not only that, but I think that by looking at Naomi, we can learn how to live our lives better as well. The story of Naomi is really a story of redeemability, of being able to come back, to go through hopelessness and to find hope once again. So to start off with looking at Naomi, I want to go to, first of all, to a verse that wasn't included in your lection today. As you can see, our verses end at 19a. And I want to start instead with verse 20, because I think it gives us some really key information without which we can't fully understand the story of Naomi. Verse 20 says this. It says, "And she said unto them," this is in Bethlehem after she's come back home and everyone's saying, "Oh, hey, look, Naomi, she's back." Naomi responds with this, "Call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty hath dealt very bitterly with me." You see, in the Old Testament, names were really important. Names weren't just used to identify someone, but a name sort of served as a summary of your key identities. It's not just what your name is, but it's who you are, what defines you as an individual. And so her former name, Naomi, in Hebrew meant pleasant. And so when Naomi comes back from this long time away from home and comes back home and says to the people who once knew her as Naomi, instead she says to them, no longer call me Naomi, but Mara, which means bitter. What she's saying when she gives these people this name change is she's saying that I've been through so much that it's altered my identity. It's altered who I am. I'm no longer pleasant. I am now bitter. And I think that this is really a key to understanding her story entirely. And I think that this is a place in which we too can begin to relate to her character as Naomi. Let me suggest to you something, my friends. There's not a person in this world, if you experience them as bitter, who is naturally and inherently a bitter person. When you think of kids outside playing in the sand or with their toys, their natural tendency is not bitterness, is it? Our natural tendency is to want to laugh and play and enjoy life and to have fun. There's only one way that someone can become bitter, and that's because of the things that happen to them throughout life. And I think that Naomi has every reason to be feeling this way, don't you? Look at the story of her life in this passage that's given to us. Naomi begins as a successful person, gets married to a merchant and moves to this hometown. They have a successful life. She has 2 successful sons who get married to 2 different beautiful women. She's living in comfort. She's living in security. She's living a wonderful life. And then suddenly, I don't know how quickly it happened, but it did. Her husband dies. One son dies. And the other dies. Now, as difficult as death itself is to handle, that wasn't all for this woman back in the ancient Near East. You see, in the ancient Near East, she had no way to claim any property as her own. Her wealth depended entirely on that of her husband, and her only retirement plan that she could have legally was to have sons. And then one son dies, and then the other son dies. And with a short amount of time, she is not only left without any loved ones, but she is left without any property, any wealth, or any prospect of ever having a job ever again. Or of obtaining any of those things. If Naomi became a bitter person, she became a bitter person because of the things that happened to her in life. And I think that there's an important lesson that we can learn from this. You see, when you and I come in contact with someone who's bitter to us, our first tendency is to react bitterly, to sort of judge them, am I right? But little do we know that lying underneath the surface of that bitterness is a great deal of pain, a great deal of history that should attract our compassion and not our judgment. You and I all know what it's like, don't we? We know what it's like to have a bad day at work. You have all these people that are on you to get this thing done and that thing done and this thing done, and then you don't get as much done as you want to get done, and then you get home and your house is a mess and you start doing the dishes, and then you cut your finger on a sharp knife, and then while you're trying to get a paper towel, you stub your toe, and the next thing you know, your kid walks through the door and asks a simple, harmless question, and suddenly you lose it. Right? Why? Is it because of the kid? No. There's nothing wrong with the kid, but all of it in that moment comes out on them, doesn't it? Do they deserve that? No, they don't deserve that. But all it is all of this stuff gets built up throughout your day. You just need one little thing to pop the balloon, and it all comes out. But my friends, the next day you forget all about it. And you're back to your normal self, because a bad day is just a bad day. But are there certain things in this life that are so terrible that they leave such scars on our souls that we don't just get over it? And after scar after scar after scar, and heart injury after heart injury after heart injury piles up, you find yourself in this constant state of just being right on the edge. And then bitterness overflows. And if we get nothing else from this sermon or from the story of Naomi, may it be that we not cast judgment on those whom we perceive to be bitter, but let us, in mercy and compassion, perceive below the choppy waters and see all that underlies what is happening. So the first thing is that Naomi, who is pleasant, becomes Mara, who is bitter. But that's not the end of the story for Mara or Naomi. That's just the beginning. Now we can go on to this next verse, in which we have Ruth introduced to us in this really unique sort of way. It says this, "But Ruth said, 'Entreat me not to leave you, or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if even death parts me from you.'" Those are beautiful lines, but I think they're even more beautiful if you comprehend their context. What is happening in this moment? You see, Ruth in this moment isn't dealing with a pleasant Naomi anymore. She's dealing with a hurt and scared and really bitter Naomi. You see, when we come in contact with those emotions out of another person, each of us has two responses that we could have. One is to return the bitterness, to return fire with fire and anger with anger. But do you know what happens if you try to put out a fire with fire? You just get a bigger fire and things escalate and get worse and more difficult, and it just gets bigger and bigger. And the person who should be receiving our compassion is instead further hurt by the bitterness that we add as well to their own bitterness. But the other response, the alternate response, can be the response of Naomi. Instead of a response of returning bitterness for bitterness, we can instead return this relentless story of mercy and of compassion and of grace. One that is never willing to give up. Do you know what the word Ruth means? And I think this is beautiful and it defines the whole story. The word Ruth in Hebrew means friend. When someone comes at you with bitterness, you can respond with bitterness, or you can respond with an endless stream of friendship. And that stream of friendship can be the means of healing. Bitterness will only ruin friendships, but mercy, grace, and compassion helps them to heal. And so, my friends, the first two things that we learn from this passion is, first of all, that bitterness always has pain lying underneath of it. And second of all, that the best answer to pain is not anger and frustration, but rather friendship, mercy, and grace. I think as we go on to the final verse, we see where this leads. We see how it comes to a resolution. The last verse of this passage says this: "So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem." The two of them went on together until they came to Bethlehem. That was, mind you, a very long and difficult journey to get to that place. But finally they came to Bethlehem. Now Bethlehem is important because it has two meanings. If you translate the word Bethlehem directly from Hebrew, what it translates as is house of bread. Isn't that beautiful? So the first thing I think that means, and then probably the most literal and obvious, is that in this passage we have a full summary of Naomi's whole story, where it starts off in wealth and happiness and pleasantness, and then through pain it turns to bitterness, and then over time it turns into abundance once again. She goes from having no bread to living in the house of bread. So we have this summary of her story arc. But even more than that, I think we can get to an even deeper, more spiritual meaning. And of course, I think we can all see it. What important event in Christian history happened in the city of Bethlehem, other than it is the place of Christ's birth? And isn't it significant that the place where Christ was born would be called the house of bread? He himself, who is the bread of life, given for the life of the world, and who offers himself to us in bread and wine every week in the Holy Mass. Do you see what the message here is? Ruth acted the way that she did because she herself, in her actions, is a foreshadowing of Christ. Jesus Christ himself, who has seen us in our own pain, in our own bitterness, and has made the decision of a friend who, instead of responding in judgment and bitterness, responds in a relentless mercy, relentless friendship, that no matter how many times we scourge him, no matter how many times we slap him in the face, No matter how many times we nail him to a cross, he always returns with, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We too, my friends, can attach ourselves to the life and mercy and love of Christ. And instead of responding to others in judgment and bitterness, we can respond with love and grace and mercy. And instead of being one that perpetuates the bitterness, we can be the ones that put an end to it. We can be the ones that lead to healing. We can be the ones that lead to Bethlehem, to the birth of Christ into this world, to the birth of a new way of doing things, to a birth of mercy, compassion, grace, and goodness. The story of Ruth is a great romance, but it's not just a romance between Ruth and Boaz. It's a romance between God and us. It's a romance between us and one another, with our families, with our friends, with our co-workers, with our world. It's a lesson in how to respond to difficult situations. It's a way of realizing that each of us have hurts and pains underneath of us that should cause us to have mercy and compassion on one another, to convey friendship instead of hurt, and in the end, to imitate the very life of Christ himself in our own relationships, and to see them transformed into redemption, so that Naomi, who becomes Mara, can become Naomi once again. Each of us needs to have with us a Ruth. And to each of us, God and the whole church together says, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. In the name of the Father, and of the Son,